Some nights, the streets of the city feel like a story waiting to be told. The buildings, dark and towering, whispered secrets through the cold night air. Flickering streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the occasional sound of distant laughter or breaking glass reminded everyone that the city never truly slept. For Joseph Carter, tonight was shaping up to be one of those nights. To most people, Joseph was just another face behind the wheel of a taxi. His silver hair and lined face told the story of a man who'd seen better days. He wasn't particularly tall or intimidating, and his quiet demeanor made him easy to overlook. People climbed into the back of his cab, barely sparing him a glance, muttering their destinations as they stared at their phones or out the window. If they bothered to notice him at all, they would probably assume he was just another tired, gray-haired man grinding through life one fare at a time. But appearances, as always, can be deceiving. Joseph had been driving his cab for nearly 2 decades, long enough to see the city evolve and not always for the better. He'd watched neighborhoods crumble under the weight of crime and corruption. He'd seen families pack up and leave, their dreams swallowed by the ever-expanding concrete jungle. But through it all, Joseph remained. The city was his home, for better or worse. Driving the night shift had its perks, but it also came with its dangers. Joseph knew how to handle drunk passengers who thought they were funny, angry ones who argued about the fare, and even the occasional scammer who tried to skip out on paying. He'd heard every excuse, every sob story, and every late-night confession you could imagine. From the loud partygoers spilling out of bars to the lonely workers heading home after a double shift, Joseph had driven them all. He never judged them. His job was simple: get them where they needed to go, no questions asked. Yet, even after all these years, the city still found ways to surprise him. The night had started like any other. The hum of the cab's engine filled the silence as Joseph cruised down a nearly empty street. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, the faint glow of the dashboard reflecting off his calm face. A faint drizzle began to fall, blurring the neon signs and traffic lights into a colorful haze. Joseph didn't mind the rain, it kept the streets quieter, the chaos of the city dampened for a while. He picked up his first fare of the evening near a downtown hotel. A young couple, laughing and leaning on each other, stumbled into the back seat. They smelled of expensive perfume and cheap champagne, their voices a mix of joy and slurred words. They gave him an address on the other side of the city, then promptly forgot he was even there, lost in their own world. Joseph drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror. He'd seen couples like this before, so wrapped up in their own lives that they barely noticed the world around them. After dropping them off, he made his way back toward the city center. His radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, some complaining about the slow night, others swapping stories about difficult passengers. Joseph didn't join in. He rarely did. He preferred the quiet, the steady rhythm of the road beneath his wheels. As the hours ticked by, Joseph found himself reflecting on his life. He wasn't one to dwell on the past, but something about the stillness of the night had a way of bringing old memories to the surface. He thought about his younger days, back when he'd worked jobs that were anything but ordinary. Those years felt like a lifetime ago, almost like they'd happened to someone else. But the skills he'd learned back then? Those stayed with him, buried beneath the surface, like a coiled spring waiting to snap into action. Most people wouldn't guess it by looking at him now. The steady, unremarkable taxi driver. But Joseph had a past he didn't talk about. The rain picked up, and Joseph turned on the wipers, the rhythmic swishing breaking the quiet. He was about to call it a night when he noticed a figure standing on the curb, waving for a cab. Joseph slowed down, pulling up beside them. A man in a heavy coat climbed into the back seat, shaking off the rain as he muttered an address. "Rough night?" Joseph asked casually, glancing in the mirror. The man didn't answer, just grunted in acknowledgement. Joseph didn't press. He knew when someone didn't want to talk. The ride was uneventful, the streets eerily empty as they wound their way through the city. When they reached the destination, the man handed Joseph a crumpled bill and stepped out without a word. Joseph sighed, watching the man disappear into the shadows. Something about him felt off. But it wasn't Joseph's place to ask questions. He put the car back in gear and pulled away. The rest of the night seemed to drag. Fare after fare, Joseph went through the motions. He thought about calling it quits, but something kept him driving. A feeling he couldn't quite explain, like the night had unfinished business. And then he heard the distant rumble of engines. At first, he thought it was just another group of motorcycles passing through. But as the noise grew louder, Joseph noticed something different. The sound didn't fade like it normally would. Instead, it lingered, growing closer with every second. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance, weaving erratically through the rain-slick streets. Bikers, he muttered under his breath. It wasn't uncommon for motorcycle gangs to roam the city at night, especially in the rougher neighborhoods. Most of the time, they kept to themselves, revving their engines and showing off for anyone who cared to look. But occasionally, they looked for trouble. Joseph's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the headlights closed in. He slowed down slightly, hoping they'd pass him by. But they didn't. The roar of the engines grew deafening as the bikers surrounded his cab, their laughter echoing in the night. One of them pulled up alongside him, slapping the side of the car with a gloved hand. Another swerved dangerously close, forcing Joseph to ease toward the curb to avoid a collision. "Move it, old man," one of them shouted, his voice muffled by the helmet he wore. Joseph didn't react. He kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. The bikers weren't satisfied with his lack of response. They circled his cab like predators, taunting him with crude remarks and daring him to fight back. One of them spat on his windshield, laughing as Joseph turned on the wipers in silence. Most people would have panicked in his situation, sped up, yelled back, or tried to escape. But Joseph wasn't like most people. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady. The bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. The bikers' taunts grew louder, their laughter echoing through the empty streets. They were enjoying this, toying with Joseph like a pack of wolves circling their prey. One of them, a younger rider with a bright red helmet, pulled up so close to the driver's side window that Joseph could see the rain streaking down his visor. "Hey, Grandpa! You fall asleep behind the wheel," the biker yelled, slapping the cab's side mirror for emphasis. Joseph didn't flinch. He didn't speed up or slow down. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, his gaze locked straight ahead. The calmness in his demeanor wasn't just unusual, it was unnerving. Inside the cab, the air grew heavy. The bikers were loud, reckless, and growing bolder by the second, but Joseph's silence was like a void they couldn't fill. His unshaken calmness made them restless. Another biker, this one wearing a tattered leather jacket with patches of a skull and crossed chains, pulled ahead and blocked the cab's path. He revved his engine, daring Joseph to stop. "Let's see what you've got, old man," he shouted, his voice brimming with arrogance. Joseph tapped the brakes, easing the cab to a stop. The rain continued to pour, streaking the windshield as the wipers rhythmically swished back and forth. His knuckles tightened on the wheel for a moment before he let out a slow, controlled breath. In the rearview mirror, Joseph saw the rest of the bikers parking their bikes in a semicircle behind his cab. Their engines roared, and their laughter filled the air like an ominous chorus. Joseph's gaze shifted briefly to the rearview mirror. His eyes narrowed, taking in the scene with a quiet calculation. "I don't think they're just out for fun," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the noise. He turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, letting the sound of the rain and the bikers' taunts fill the silence inside the cab. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached for the handle of the door and stepped out into the wet night. Joseph's boots splashed lightly in the puddles as he straightened up, his hands resting calmly at his sides. The bikers watched him, their laughter subsiding slightly as they sized him up. He didn't look like much a wiry man in his late 50s, his gray hair plastered to his head from the rain, and his jacket worn from years of use. But there was something in his stance, something subtle but undeniable, that gave the bikers pause. "Well, well," said the biker in the red helmet, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like Gramps decided to come out and play." Another biker, this one chewing on a toothpick, chuckled and swung a chain lazily in his hand. "What's the matter, old-timer? Scared we're gonna scratch up your precious taxi?" Joseph tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His calm eyes scanned the group, noting every detail: their body language, their positions, the way their bikes were parked. "Doesn't seem like you boys have a destination," Joseph said finally, his voice low and even. "Or is this how you get your kicks? Harassing people who mind their own business?" The red-helmeted biker laughed, throwing his head back as if Joseph had just told the best joke of the night. "Harassing? Oh, come on, Gramps. We're just having a little fun. You know, livin' a little. Maybe you should try it sometime." Joseph didn't respond. He simply stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes locked on the biker with an intensity that wasn't easily ignored. One of the younger bikers, clearly eager to impress, stepped forward. He jabbed a finger at Joseph, his voice loud and aggressive. "What's your problem, old man? You think you're better than us? Huh? Say something." Joseph finally moved. He took a single step forward, and for a brief moment, the younger biker hesitated. There was something about Joseph's presence, a quiet authority that didn't match his appearance. "You should leave," Joseph said simply, his voice calm but firm. The younger biker's hesitation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Emboldened by the laughter of his friends, he stepped closer, puffing out his chest. "Or what? What are you gonna do, huh? Call the cops? You don't scare me, old man." Joseph's eyes flicked to the younger biker, then to the others. He noticed their smirks, their overconfidence, and their complete lack of awareness. They thought they were in control. They couldn't have been more wrong. The biker with the chain stepped forward, swinging it lazily in a circle. He grinned at Joseph, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "Listen, Gramps. Why don't you just hand over your wallet and your keys, and we'll be on our way? Sound fair?" Joseph raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging. "Fair," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Yeah, fair," the biker said, his grin widening. "You get to keep your life, and we get, well, whatever we want." For the first time, Joseph allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Fair," he said again, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made the biker's grin falter slightly. The red-helmeted biker, sensing the tension, stepped in. "All right, enough chit-chat. Let's teach this guy a lesson and get outta here." He revved his engine, the roar of the bike cutting through the rain-soaked air. The others cheered, their confidence growing as they prepared to intimidate Joseph into submission. But Joseph didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his calm gaze fixed on the red-helmeted biker. "You really shouldn't do this," Joseph said quietly, his tone carrying a weight that made even the boldest of the bikers pause. The red-helmeted biker sneered, clearly unimpressed. "Oh yeah? And why's that, old man? You gonna call your grandkids to come save you?" Joseph didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch out, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and unshaken. "Because," he said, taking another step forward, "you have no idea who I am." The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter faltering slightly. There was something unsettling about the way Joseph said it, calm, almost detached, like he wasn't trying to intimidate them but simply stating a fact. The younger biker, still eager to prove himself, took another step forward. "We don't care who you are, old man. You're just a taxi driver. Now hand over your stuff, or we'll take it ourselves." Joseph's faint smile returned. "Is that so?" And with that, everything changed. Joseph moved faster than any of them expected. One moment, he was standing still in the rain. The next, he'd stepped inside the younger biker's guard, his hand snapping out to grab the chain before it could swing toward him. With a single, precise movement, he twisted the chain out of the biker's grip, sending him stumbling backward into a puddle. The other bikers froze, their jeers and laughter replaced by stunned silence. "You shouldn't have done that," Joseph said, his voice as calm as ever. But this time, there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. The red-helmeted biker revved his engine again, his earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he shouted at the others. "Get him." Joseph sighed. "I warned you." What happened next was a blur of movement. To the bikers, it felt like chaos, Joseph weaving between them with precision that defied his age, disarming and incapacitating them one by one. But to Joseph, it was second nature, the kind of instinct that came from years of experience in a life he thought he'd left behind. The rain continued to pour, washing away the overconfidence and bravado of the bikers as they lay sprawled on the ground, groaning and clutching their injuries. Joseph stood in the middle of it all, his jacket soaked, his breath steady. "Now," he said, looking down at the red-helmeted biker, who was clutching his ribs and glaring up at him, "I believe I asked you to leave." The biker didn't respond, his earlier arrogance replaced by a silent, seething fury. Joseph leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Next time, pick your fights more carefully." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his cab, leaving the bikers to lick their wounds in the rain. He didn't see them at first, not until the roar of motorcycles cut through the night like a sharp blade. The gang of bikers came out of nowhere, weaving dangerously close to his cab, their laughter echoing down the empty streets. Joseph's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as his eyes darted to the side mirrors. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off chrome handlebars and leather jackets. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more, their bikes rumbling like a pack of wild animals closing in on their prey. They surrounded him, their engines revving in unison, a symphony of menace. One biker, wearing a black helmet with red flames painted on the sides, pulled up close to Joseph's window and rapped his knuckles against the glass. "Move it, old man," he barked, his voice muffled by the helmet but loud enough to pierce through the cab's closed windows. Another biker sped ahead and swerved dangerously in front of Joseph's car, forcing him to tap the brakes. The cab jerked forward, its headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. Joseph sighed quietly, his breath steady despite the chaos around him. He wasn't a man who scared easily. Years behind the wheel had shown him all kinds of people, desperate, drunk, angry. But this was something different. One of the bikers slammed a gloved hand against the rear passenger window, leaving a muddy streak. Another spat on the windshield, laughing as the wipers struggled to clear the mess. "Look at this guy," one of them yelled over the roaring engines. "Doesn't even flinch." Joseph's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. He didn't speed up or swerve to escape. He just kept driving, the rain falling harder now, its rhythmic drumming on the roof masking the sound of his breathing. Inside the cab, the air felt heavy. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearing midnight, too late for most people to be out, except for those looking for trouble. Joseph muttered to himself, barely above a whisper, "You chose the wrong night, boys." The bikers weren't satisfied with his lack of reaction. They thrived on fear, on the power of making others feel small and helpless. but Joseph wasn't giving them the response they wanted, and that only fueled their aggression. The biker with the flaming helmet pulled ahead, cutting Joseph off again. He slowed his bike to a crawl, forcing the cab to inch forward at an agonizing pace. Behind Joseph, the rest of the gang formed a tight line, boxing him in. One of them, a lanky man with a skull painted on his helmet, rode up alongside the passenger side and slapped the door with a loud thud. "Hey, Grandpa! You lost? Need us to call your nursing home?" he jeered, leaning close enough that Joseph could see the raindrops beating on his visor. Joseph didn't take the bait. His face was unreadable, his grip on the wheel firm but not panicked. The biker laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from genuine amusement. It was cruel, laced with the thrill of dominance. He revved his engine and kicked at the cab's rear tire, the force causing the vehicle to jolt slightly. Still, Joseph didn't react. Another biker, younger and more impulsive, rode up on the driver's side and made a crude gesture. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Joseph turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the biker's for the first time. There was no fear in his gaze, only a calm, steady intensity that made the younger man falter for half a second before recovering. The biker leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "You deaf or just stupid? We're talking to you." Joseph's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, barely noticeable. "You're talking," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just not listening." The biker blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected response. His hesitation lasted only a moment before he laughed again, louder this time, as if trying to mask his unease. "Oh, you've got a smart mouth, huh?" the biker said, his tone turning sharp. Joseph didn't answer. He returned his attention to the road, his calm demeanor unshaken. The rain intensified, the downpour drenching the bikers as they continued their game of intimidation. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard and a jacket covered in patches, shouted to the others, "Let's see if this old guy can keep up." With that, he gunned his engine and sped ahead, weaving from side to side as if daring Joseph to follow. The others joined in, revving their bikes and circling the cab like sharks around a stranded boat. The sound was deafening, a chaotic mix of engines roaring, tires splashing through puddles, and taunts hurled through the rain. Inside the cab, Joseph's fingers flexed slightly on the steering wheel. His calm exterior didn't betray the flicker of irritation rising within him. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. He knew the type: bullies who thought numbers made them untouchable, who fed off the fear of others. He also knew one crucial fact: bullies always underestimated the wrong person. The leader of the gang, a man with a scar running down his cheek, rode up beside Joseph's window. He removed his helmet, letting the rain soak his dark hair as he stared into the cab. "What's your deal, old man?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're too good to be scared?" Joseph glanced at him briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "I think you've got too much time on your hands." The leader's jaw tightened. He didn't like being dismissed, especially not by someone like Joseph, someone he deemed weak and insignificant. "You've got a smart mouth," the leader said, his tone dangerous. "But let me tell you something, old man. Out here, it's not about being smart. It's about knowing when to back down." Joseph's gaze didn't waver. "Is that so?" The leader smirked, leaning closer. "Yeah. And right now? You're outnumbered. Out here, that means you've already lost." Joseph's response was measured, his tone devoid of emotion. "Numbers don't mean as much as you think." The leader's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he barked a laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Behind him, the other bikers roared their engines in agreement, their taunts growing louder. Joseph sighed, his patience thinning. He muttered under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear, "I told you boys you chose the wrong night." The tension hung heavy in the air, the rain beating down relentlessly as the bikers prepared to escalate their game. The leader raised a hand, signaling the others to spread out. They fanned out across the street, blocking Joseph's path entirely. The leader pointed at Joseph. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his voice cold. Joseph didn't move. He remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, taking in the positions of the other bikers. "I said, get out of the car," the leader shouted, his voice rising. Joseph finally reached for the door handle. He pushed it open slowly, stepping out into the rain. The bikers watched him closely, their laughter fading as they sized him up. He looked unremarkable, an aging taxi driver with gray hair and a weather jacket, standing in the middle of the street with rain dripping from his face. But there was something about him, something in the way he stood, the way he carried himself, that made the leader pause. Joseph's calm gaze swept over the group, taking in their sneers and posturing. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he spoke. "I'm only going to say this once," he said, his voice steady. "Walk away." The bikers stared at him in stunned silence for a moment before erupting into laughter. "Walk away," the leader repeated, his tone mocking. "You really think you're in a position to be giving orders, old man?" Joseph didn't answer. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the leader. The tension crackled in the air like a live wire, the rain falling harder as the bikers prepared to make their move. But Joseph didn't flinch. He didn't waver. He simply stood his ground, a lone figure in the storm, waiting for what he knew was coming next. The laughter among the bikers grew louder, bouncing off the rain-slicked buildings around them. Their leader, with his scarred cheek and growing impatience, took a step forward, the solace of his boots splashing in shallow puddles. "Listen to him," one of the younger bikers sneered. "He thinks he's the boss now." Joseph remained still. His hands hung loosely by his sides, but his entire demeanor radiated something that even the bikers, in their arrogance, couldn't ignore. It wasn't fear, nor was it rage. It was a quiet, unnerving confidence that didn't match his appearance. The leader tilted his head, his expression shifting between amusement and frustration. "You've got some nerve, I'll give you that," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "But you don't seem to understand how this works." The rain continued to pour, the steady rhythm of droplets mixing with the low rumble of the motorcycle still idling behind Joseph. "You see," the leader continued, circling Joseph slowly, "this is our turf. And out here, you do what we say, or there's a price to pay." Joseph's eyes followed the leader as he moved, unblinking and steady. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm. "You think this is your turf," he said, his words cutting through the rain like a blade, "but tonight, you're out of your depth." The gang erupted into laughter again, their mockery ringing out into the empty street. One of the bikers, a hulking man with a chain slung over his shoulder, pointed at Joseph and said, "Old man's got jokes. Maybe we should teach him some respect." The leader stopped circling, now standing directly in front of Joseph, just inches away. He looked him up and down, sizing him up one last time. "You're either the bravest guy I've ever met," the leader said, his voice low, "or the dumbest." Joseph didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply held the leader's gaze and said, "Why don't you find out?" The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of something that looked almost like hesitation. It was fleeting, but Joseph caught it. The younger biker with the skull helmet took a step closer, itching for action. "Boss, what are we waiting for? Let's show this guy what happens when you mouth off to us." The leader held up a hand, silencing the gang. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Joseph, as if trying to decode the enigma standing before him. Joseph met his gaze evenly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You talk a lot," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm around them. "But talking only gets you so far." The leader's jaw tightened. "Is that right?" Joseph nodded slowly. "The problem with people like you," he said, "is that you think numbers and noise make you strong. But real strength? It's quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself." The leader's face darkened. His gang was watching, and his authority was on the line. He couldn't let this nobody make him look weak. Without warning, the leader grabbed Joseph by the collar, yanking him forward. The bikers cheered, their shouts echoing through the rain-soaked street. "What's quiet strength gonna do for you now, huh?" the leader snarled, his face inches from Joseph's. Joseph's calm expression didn't waver. If anything, his gaze grew sharper, more focused. "You're about to find out," he said simply. The next few seconds happened so quickly that even the bikers, who had been egging their leader on moments before, were left stunned. Joseph moved with a speed and precision that belied his age and tired appearance. His hand shot up, grabbing the leader's wrist in a vice-like grip. In one fluid motion, he twisted, forcing the leader to release his hold and stumble backward, clutching his arm in pain. The gang went silent, their jeers replaced by a stunned disbelief. The leader staggered, his face contorted in a mix of shock and anger. "What the hell?" he began, but Joseph didn't give him time to finish. Before anyone could react, Joseph took a deliberate step forward, his movements calm but undeniably purposeful. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a show of his actions. He simply looked at the leader and said, "Walk away." For a moment, there was only the sound of rain and the faint hum of the motorcycle still idling in the background. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. People were supposed to beg, to cower, to run. Not this. The younger biker with the skull helmet broke the silence, his voice high and shaky. "You think you can just pull that and get away with it?" Joseph turned his gaze to him, and for the first time, the younger man hesitated. There was something in Joseph's eyes, something cold, calculating, and entirely unafraid that made him take an involuntary step back. "I won't say it again," Joseph said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Walk away." But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged. He straightened, shaking off his earlier stumble, and gestured to his gang. "Get him," he growled. The bikers hesitated for a split second, unsure. But loyalty or maybe fear compelled them to obey. They revved their engines and closed in, forming a tightening circle around Joseph. Joseph took a deep breath, his hands flexing slightly at his sides. He glanced at the circle forming around him, then back at the leader. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. The leader sneered. "No, old man. You made the mistake." The first biker lunged forward, swinging the chain he carried like a weapon. But Joseph was ready. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking it with enough force to send the biker sprawling into the wet pavement. The second biker tried to come at him from behind, but Joseph spun, delivering a precise kick that knocked the man off balance and sent him crashing into his own bike. The rest of the gang froze, their confidence evaporating as quickly as the rain pooling around their boots. Joseph stood in the center of the chaos, calm and unshaken, as if this were just another ordinary night. "You still want to do this?" he asked, his voice cutting through the rain like a knife. The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering. His gang, once so loud and boisterous, was now silent, their aggression replaced by fear. Joseph took a step closer, his presence commanding, unyielding. "I've spent years dealing with people like you," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. "You think you own the night, but you don't. You're just boys pretending to be men." The leader swallowed hard, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Joseph's gaze bored into him. Leave. Now. The leader's jaw clenched, but he knew he was beaten. He turned to his gang and barked, "Let's go." One by one, the bikers mounted their bikes, their engines roaring as they sped off into the night. Joseph watched them go, his expression unreadable. When the last tail light disappeared into the rain, he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. He turned and walked back to his cab, the rain still falling around him. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. "You told them," he muttered to himself with a faint smirk. "Wrong night." And with that, he started the engine and drove off into the stormy night, leaving the empty street behind him. The biker's knuckles rapped against the taxi door with a force that sent vibrations through the frame. Joseph turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the biker's through the rain-speckled window. His face remained calm, almost impassive, but his gaze carried a quiet intensity that pierced through the bravado of the man beside him. The biker sneered, his confidence unwavering for now. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue," he shouted over the roar of the bikes and the engine. Joseph didn't respond. Instead, his hands tightened on the wheel, his fingers curling against the worn leather as he maintained his steady pace. The silence wasn't submission, it was something far more deliberate. The biker revved his engine, swerving closer, his fist pounding the window again. "I'm talking to you," he barked, his voice tinged with frustration. And then it happened. With a sudden, precise motion, Joseph swerved just enough to force the biker to veer away, his motorcycle wobbling precariously on the slick pavement. The man cursed loudly, regaining control just in time to avoid slamming into a parked car. The gang roared with laughter behind him, their mockery echoing in the damp night air. But Joseph? He didn't even glance back. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, his focus unbroken. The chase continued, the bikers becoming more aggressive as their frustration mounted. They tried boxing him in, forcing him into a narrow alley lined with graffiti-covered walls and overflowing dumpsters. "Nowhere to run now, old man," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. Joseph slowed the taxi, the engine purring as he came to a stop. The bikers closed in around him, their headlights casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Inside the cab, Joseph exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the windshield. He reached over and adjusted the rearview mirror, his movements deliberate and measured. The leader of the gang, the man with the scarred cheek, dismounted his bike and swaggered toward the driver's side window. He tapped on the glass with the tip of his knife, the metal making a sharp, grating sound. "Game's over," the leader said, his grin wide and menacing. "Time to pay up." Joseph rolled down the window slightly, the rain immediately dripping onto his sleeve. He looked up at the leader, his expression unreadable. "You boys seem to have a lot of energy," Joseph said, his voice calm but firm. "But maybe you should think about where you're spending it." The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Oh, we're spending it right where we want to," he said. "Now, why don't you hand over your wallet and save us all some trouble?" Joseph tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request. Then, he leaned back against the headrest, his gaze shifting from the leader to the rest of the gang. "You know," Joseph said, his tone almost conversational, "there's an old saying about poking the wrong bear." The leader frowned. "What are you rambling about?" Joseph's eyes flicked back to the man, his expression sharpening. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "you don't know what you've started." The leader's patience snapped. He grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. "Enough of this." But before he could finish, Joseph moved. With the speed and precision of someone far younger than his years, Joseph's hand shot out, grabbing the leader's wrist in an iron grip. The man's knife clattered to the ground, the sound swallowed by the rain. The bikers froze, their laughter and taunts dying in their throats. "Careful now," Joseph said, his voice low and steady. "You don't want to do something you'll regret." The leader struggled against Joseph's grip, his bravado crumbling as he realized just how strong the man was. "What the hell?" he began, but Joseph cut him off with a sharp twist of his wrist, forcing him to his knees. "You think you're in control," Joseph said, his tone even. "But let me tell you something. I've been dealing with men like you my whole life. And every single one of them thought they were untouchable." The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence wavering as they watched their leader, usually so untouchable, brought low by this unassuming taxi driver. "Let him go," one of the younger bikers shouted, revving his engine as if trying to summon some courage. Joseph glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Do you really want to be next?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the younger man hesitate. The leader gritted his teeth, his pride battling against the pain in his wrist. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. Joseph leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto the leader's. "No," he said quietly. "You don't." Joseph released the leader's wrist, shoving him back toward his gang. The man stumbled, catching himself before glaring up at Joseph with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," the leader growled, his voice shaking. Joseph didn't respond. Instead, he rolled up his window and shifted the taxi into reverse, backing out of the alley with a precision that left the gang standing in the rain, their bikes idling as they watched him go. But Joseph knew better than to assume it was over. As he turned onto the main road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The bikers were already mounting their bikes, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they followed him once more. Joseph's lips pressed into a thin line. He had hoped to avoid a full confrontation, but it was clear these men wouldn't let him go so easily. He reached over to the glove compartment, pulling it open to reveal a small, weathered notebook. The pages were filled with names, dates, and notes written in a precise hand. He flipped through it quickly, his fingers brushing against the familiar texture of the paper. "Not tonight," he muttered to himself, closing the notebook and tossing it back into the glove compartment. The chase resumed, the bikers becoming more reckless with each passing mile. They tried everything blocking his path, forcing him into dead ends, even throwing objects at the cab. But no matter what they did, Joseph remained unshaken. He maneuvered the taxi with a skill that seemed almost supernatural, weaving through narrow alleys and sharp turns with ease. It was as if he had memorized every inch of the city, knowing exactly where to go and when to move. The bikers, despite their numbers and aggression, found themselves struggling to keep up. One of them, a wiry man with a bandana tied around his face, shouted over the roar of the engines, "How the hell is he doing this?" The leader didn't respond, his focus fixed on the taxi ahead. But deep down, even he was beginning to feel a gnawing sense of unease. This wasn't normal. Inside the cab, Joseph's mind was calm, his thoughts focused. He had spent years preparing for nights like this, though he had hoped they were behind him. As he turned onto a quieter street, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The gang was still there, their determination unyielding. Joseph sighed, his grip on the wheel tightening. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steady. "If this is how it has to be." He glanced at the dashboard, his fingers brushing against a small switch hidden beneath the steering column. With a flick of his wrist, the switch engaged, and the taxi's engine let out a low, guttural growl. The game had just changed. The engine of Joseph's taxi roared louder than before, a sound that startled the bikers for a brief moment. They exchanged confused glances but quickly shook it off, revving their motorcycles and surging forward to catch up. Joseph remained calm, navigating the maze-like streets of the city with precision that defied logic. The rain fell harder now, turning the road slick and treacherous, but he moved as though he'd driven these streets 1,000 times under worse conditions. Behind him, the bikers struggled to maintain control on the wet pavement. Their tires skidded on sharp turns, and more than once, one of them nearly lost balance. "Stick to him," the leader barked, his voice barely audible over the storm and the roar of engines. Joseph's mind was sharp, calculating every move. He knew this part of the city well, better than most. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on postcards or tourist brochures. These streets had history, most of it buried under years of neglect and shadows. As he drove, he glanced briefly at the side mirrors, observing the gang's formation. They were close, but not close enough to stop him. Not yet. One of the bikers, a younger man with a flaming skull painted on his helmet, sped ahead, trying to cut Joseph off. The man swerved into Joseph's lane, his bike skidding slightly as he matched the taxi's speed. Joseph didn't flinch. The biker grinned, tapping on the taxi's window with the edge of a crowbar he had pulled from his side. "Where you gonna go now, old man?" Joseph's eyes flicked to the crowbar, then to the biker's face. Without a word, he made a sharp turn into a narrow alley. The biker hesitated for half a second too long before following, his bike struggling to navigate the tight space. The alley was a labyrinth of sharp turns and obstacles, abandoned trash cans, forgotten crates, and the occasional stray cat darting out of sight. Joseph maneuvered through it all with ease, his taxi barely missing the walls on either side. The biker, however, wasn't so lucky. As the alley grew narrower, the man's handlebars scraped against the walls, throwing off his balance. He swore loudly, trying to regain control, but it was too late. His bike tipped, skidding across the wet pavement before slamming into a stack of wooden pallets. Joseph glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the biker tumble to the ground. He wasn't seriously hurt, just dazed and furious. One down, Joseph thought, his expression still unreadable. The rest of the gang wasn't far behind. They roared into the alley, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The leader, his face a mask of rage, shouted orders to his men. "Split up. Cut him off at the next block." Joseph heard the command even over the sound of the storm and engines. His lips curled into a faint smirk. "Good luck with that," he muttered. He emerged from the alley onto a quiet back street, the rain now pouring in sheets. The city around him seemed almost deserted, the usual hum of late-night life drowned out by the storm. But Joseph wasn't alone. The gang regrouped quickly, their bikes forming a loose semicircle behind the taxi. They were relentless, their determination fueled by pride and anger. Inside the cab, Joseph adjusted the rearview mirror again, his calm demeanor hiding the storm brewing beneath the surface. He glanced at the dashboard, his fingers brushing against another hidden switch. "Let's see how much you boys really want this," he said quietly. The leader signaled for one of his men to move ahead, attempting to box Joseph in from the front. The biker sped past the taxi, his tires kicking up a spray of water as he positioned himself at the next intersection. Joseph saw the trap forming but didn't slow down. Instead, he accelerated, the taxi's engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. The biker in front hesitated, his confidence faltering as he realized Joseph wasn't stopping. At the last second, Joseph veered slightly to the right, clipping the edge of the biker's handlebars. The man lost control, his bike spinning out before crashing into a pile of garbage bags on the sidewalk. The rest of the gang swerved to avoid their fallen comrade, their formation breaking apart in the chaos. Joseph used the opening to his advantage, taking a sharp turn down another side street. He pushed the taxi to its limits, the engine roaring as he gained distance. But the bikers weren't giving up. The leader, now furious beyond reason, urged his men to regroup. "Stay on him," he shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. They pursued him relentlessly, their bikes weaving through traffic and obstacles as they closed the gap. The city's streets became a battleground, the storm adding an almost cinematic intensity to the chase. Joseph led them through industrial zones, abandoned warehouses, and forgotten corners of the city. Each turn seemed to bring them deeper into a place where the rules didn't apply, a place Joseph knew all too well. As the gang followed, they began to notice something strange. The streets Joseph chose weren't random. They weren't just shortcuts or escape routes. They were deliberate. One of the bikers, a lanky man with a scar running down his neck, slowed slightly as a sense of unease crept over him. "Boss," he called out, his voice shaky, "I think he's leading us somewhere." The leader ignored him, his focus fixed on the taxi ahead. But the truth was, Joseph was leading them. Inside the cab, Joseph's expression shifted slightly. His calm exterior cracked just enough to reveal a hint of determination, a glimpse of the man he once was. He reached into the center console, pulling out a small, worn photograph. It was faded and crumpled, the edges frayed from years of handling. In the photo, a younger Joseph stood beside a woman and a little girl, their faces bright with joy. The memory lingered for a moment before Joseph tucked the photo back into its place. His grip on the wheel tightened. This wasn't just about shaking off a gang of reckless bikers. This was about finishing something he'd started a long time ago. The bikers began to realize they weren't chasing their prey anymore, they were being lured. The streets grew darker, the buildings more decrepit. Street lights flickered or were missing entirely, casting eerie shadows over the scene. "Where the hell is he taking us?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The leader didn't answer. But deep down, even he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. Joseph turned one final corner, the taxi disappearing into an abandoned lot surrounded by towering warehouses. The gang followed, their bikes skidding slightly on the rain-soaked asphalt. They came to a stop, their engines idling as they surveyed the area. The lot was eerily quiet, the only sounds the patter of rain and the low rumble of their engines. Joseph's taxi sat in the center, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. The leader dismounted his bike, his boots splashing in the puddles as he approached the cab. His men followed, their weapons drawn. "You've got nowhere to run now, old man," the leader said, his voice echoing in the empty lot. Inside the taxi, Joseph took a deep breath. He reached for the final hidden switch beneath the dashboard. And with a flick, the game changed once more. The leader of the bikers, a bulky man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, towering over Joseph. His leather jacket was adorned with patches and symbols meant to intimidate, and his voice was full of mockery. "You think you can take all of us, old man? This ain't a retirement home. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." The rest of the gang laughed, their confidence palpable. They revved their engines for dramatic effect, headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the lot. Joseph didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots splashing lightly in a puddle. The storm had subsided to a drizzle, but the air crackled with tension. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned each of the bikers, taking in their weapons, their stances, their weaknesses. "You boys think you've got me figured out," Joseph said, his voice low and steady. "But you don't even know who you're dealing with." One of the younger bikers, emboldened by the taunts of his comrades, lunged at Joseph with a crowbar raised high. "Big mistake." Joseph sidestepped with precision, grabbing the biker's wrist in mid-swing. With a fluid motion, he twisted the crowbar out of the man's grasp and used the momentum to send him sprawling into the mud. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. The laughter died. The gang stared, stunned into silence. The leader snarled, stepping closer. "What the hell was that? You think you're some kind of action hero?" Joseph tossed the crowbar to the ground with a clatter, rolling his neck as if warming up. "No," he said simply. "I'm just a man who knows how to finish what others start." The tattoos on his arms were now visible under the dim light, intricate designs that weren't just decorative, they told a story. Symbols of service, loyalty, and danger. One of the older bikers squinted, his face paling as recognition set in. "Wait. I've seen those before," he said, his voice trembling. "You're not just a taxi driver, are you? You're..." Joseph raised a brow, cutting him off. "That's right. And if you were smart, you'd have stayed away." The leader wasn't buying it. He motioned for his men to advance. "I don't care who he is. He's just one guy, and there's 10 of us. Take him down." 2 bikers charged at once, one wielding a knife and the other a chain. Joseph moved like lightning. He ducked under the first swing of the chain, grabbing it mid-air and yanking the biker off balance. With a sharp tug, he sent the man crashing into his comrade, the knife clattering to the ground. Before anyone could react, Joseph grabbed the knife and threw it into the ground near the leader's feet, a deliberate statement. "That was your warning shot," Joseph said, his voice calm but firm. "The next one won't miss." The leader growled in frustration. "What are you waiting for? Get him." The gang hesitated. They weren't cowards, but there was something about Joseph, his calm demeanor, his calculated movements, that unnerved them. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a mohawk, whispered to the leader, "Boss, I don't think this guy's normal. He fights like he's trained." "Military, maybe." "Shut up," the leader snapped. "He's just an old man. He can't take all of us." But Joseph wasn't waiting for them to decide. He advanced, his steps deliberate, his presence commanding. Another biker swung a tire iron at him, but Joseph caught it with one hand, twisting it out of the man's grasp before delivering a quick strike to his midsection. The biker crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The rest of the gang finally snapped out of their stupor and attacked in unison. For most people, it would have been overwhelming: 10 angry bikers with weapons, rushing all at once. But Joseph wasn't most people. He moved with a precision that spoke of years of experience, anticipating their moves before they even made them. He used their weapons against them, disarming one and sending him stumbling into another. He ducked, dodged, and countered with an efficiency that left no wasted motion. A chain whistled through the air, aiming for Joseph's head. He caught it mid-swing, using it to whip its owner's legs out from under him. A knife came next, slashing toward his chest. Joseph sidestepped, grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. Punches and kicks rained down from all directions, but Joseph deflected them with ease, his movements a blur of calculated force. Within minutes, half the gang was on the ground, groaning in pain or too dazed to continue. The leader stood frozen, watching in disbelief as Joseph systematically dismantled his crew. This isn't possible," he muttered, his confidence crumbling. Joseph turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You picked the wrong guy to mess with. And now you're going to pay the price." The leader, desperate to regain control, pulled a gun from his jacket. He pointed it at Joseph, his hands shaking. "Stay back." Joseph didn't blink. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the leader's. "You don't want to do that," Joseph said, his voice calm but firm. The leader's finger hovered over the trigger, but something in Joseph's gaze stopped him. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, something primal. "You're ex-military, aren't you?" the leader whispered, his voice barely audible. "Special forces or something?" Joseph smirked. "Something like that." Before the leader could react, Joseph moved. In a flash, he closed the distance between them, disarming the gun with a move so quick it was almost invisible. The weapon clattered to the ground as Joseph grabbed the leader by the collar, pinning him against the side of the cab. "You've spent your life bullying people, thinking you're untouchable," Joseph said, his voice low and menacing. "But there's always someone stronger, someone smarter. Tonight, that someone is me." The leader struggled, but Joseph's grip was ironclad. Call off your men, Joseph demanded. The leader hesitated, then nodded weakly. Stand down, he shouted to the remaining bikers. The lot fell silent, save for the rain tapping against the asphalt. Joseph released the leader, who slumped to the ground, defeated. You got lucky, the leader muttered, his voice bitter. Joseph crouched down, staring him in the eye. This wasn't luck. This was a lesson. Next time, think twice before you pick a fight with someone who looks like an easy target. The bikers helped their injured comrades to their feet, retreating one by one. As they mounted their bikes and roared away into the night, Joseph stood tall, watching them disappear into the darkness. He let out a long breath, the tension finally leaving his body. Climbing back into his cab, he pulled out the worn photograph again, his fingers brushing over the faces of the woman and child. This one was for you, he murmured softly, tucking the photo away. As the taxi's engine rumbled to life, Joseph drove off into the night, leaving the abandoned lot and the chaos behind him. The city was quiet again, but for Joseph, the echoes of the past and the lessons of the present would never fade. Joseph sat in his cab for a moment after the gang had sped off into the shadows, the faint hum of their engines fading into silence. The rain continued its soft patter against the windshield, the city around him quiet once more. But the battle wasn't over, not in Joseph's mind. He glanced at the photo again, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His wife, Claire, and his daughter, Lily, stared back at him, frozen in time. This wasn't the first time he'd had to confront danger. It wasn't even the worst. But tonight's fight stirred memories that Joseph had long tried to bury. As he drove through the city streets, his mind wandered back to the life he had left behind, a life filled with adrenaline, danger, and decisions that had cost him dearly. Years ago, Joseph had been part of an elite unit, operating in the shadows of war-torn regions. They had trained him to be ruthless, efficient, and unstoppable. He'd been proud of his service, proud of the lives he'd saved. But those years had taken a toll. The loss of his comrades, the haunting decisions he'd been forced to make, they had carved deep scars into his soul. When he met Claire, everything changed. She became his anchor, pulling him out of the darkness. And Lily, their little girl, had been the light of his life. For them, Joseph had walked away from the chaos. He'd traded his weapons for a taximeter, his missions for mundane city routes. But the past never truly lets go. Joseph's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as the memory of that fateful night resurfaced. He had been driving his cab, just like tonight, when a group of thugs decided to use him as their target. They didn't know who they were messing with back then either. But the price of standing his ground had been too high. Claire and Lily had been caught in the crossfire, not physically, but emotionally. The threats Joseph had received after defending himself that night had made it clear, his family was at risk. So, he'd sent them away. He had begged Claire to take Lily and leave the city, to find a safe place where his past couldn't reach them. And they had, though it broke his heart. Now, he lived alone, working long hours behind the wheel, trying to stay invisible. But tonight, the bikers had reminded him of who he truly was. Joseph's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of another motorcycle engine in the distance. His pulse quickened, his instincts sharpening like a blade. He glanced in the rearview mirror. A single headlight pierced through the darkness, growing brighter as it approached. Joseph's jaw tightened. Guess they didn't learn their lesson, he muttered under his breath. The biker pulled up alongside his cab, slowing to match his speed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Joseph kept his eyes on the road, but his peripheral vision stayed locked on the figure beside him. The biker raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of peace. Joseph frowned, easing his foot off the accelerator. The biker motioned for him to pull over. Joseph hesitated. It could be a trap, but something about the biker's body language seemed different. Reluctantly, Joseph turned onto a quiet side street, bringing the cab to a stop under a flickering street lamp. The biker dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a young man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes. He approached cautiously, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to fight," the biker said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Joseph stepped out of the cab, his posture guarded. "You've got 10 seconds to tell me why you're here before I make you regret stopping me." The young man held up a hand. "Wait. I'm not like the others. I needed to talk to you." Joseph narrowed his eyes. "Talk to me about what?" The biker hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "I know who you are." Joseph's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. "You've got me confused with someone else." "No, I don't," the biker insisted. "The tattoos, the way you fought tonight, it's you. You're the ghost." Joseph's blood ran cold. That name. He hadn't heard it in years. The Ghost. It was the nickname his unit had given him during his military days, a name that struck fear into enemies and earned grudging respect from allies. It wasn't just a name, it was a legend. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joseph said, his voice firm. The biker took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't care about your past. I just need your help." Joseph crossed his arms, his eyes boring into the young man. "Help with what?" The biker swallowed hard. "The gang. They're not going to let this go. You embarrassed them tonight, and they're going to come back with more guys. A lot more." "That's not my problem," Joseph said, turning to get back into his cab. "It will be when they target you again," the biker shot back. "And trust me, they will." Joseph paused, his hand on the door handle. He knew the kid was right. The gang wouldn't just let this slide. The biker took a deep breath. "I'm trying to get out, okay? I didn't sign up for this life. But leaving isn't easy. They don't just let people walk away." Joseph studied him for a long moment. There was sincerity in the young man's eyes, a desperation that reminded Joseph of himself at a younger age. "You've got a name, kid." The biker nodded. "Ryan." Joseph sighed, leaning against the cab. "All right, Ryan. Let's say I believe you. Why come to me? Why not go to the police?" Ryan shook his head. "The police? You think they care? Half of them are on the gang's payroll. The other half are too scared to do anything. But you took them down like it was nothing. If anyone can stop them, it's you." Joseph rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had sworn to leave this life behind, to live quietly and avoid trouble. But trouble seemed to find him anyway. Ryan's voice softened. "Please. I've got a sister. She's just a kid. I don't want her growing up in this mess. I need to get her out of here. But I can't do it alone." Joseph's eyes flickered to the photo in his cab. Claire. Lily. The family he had fought to protect. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right, kid. I'll help you. But if we're doing this, we do it my way. No shortcuts, no second chances." Ryan's face lit up with relief. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Joseph nodded, his expression hardening. "Good. Now let's get to work." The parking lot was eerily silent except for the groans of the defeated bikers and the faint crackle of rain on the asphalt. The gang's bravado had crumbled, replaced by stunned disbelief and the cold sting of humiliation. Joseph leaned against his cab, his breathing steady despite the intense confrontation that had unfolded moments ago. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, just the calm of a man who had been through worse and emerged unshaken. One biker, his helmet now lopsided on his head, clutched his side as he struggled to sit upright. He stared at Joseph with wide eyes, unable to reconcile the unassuming cab driver with the whirlwind of precise, brutal efficiency they had just witnessed. Joseph met the biker's gaze, his own steely and unwavering. "You thought tonight was going to be fun, didn't you? Messing with the wrong guy, making a little noise. But I warned you." Another biker, still clutching his arm where Joseph had disarmed him earlier, spat angrily. "What are you, some kind of cop? Military? What gives you the right?" Joseph's voice cut through the man's rant like a knife. "What gives me the right?" He stepped closer, looming over the man with a quiet intensity. "I didn't ask for this. You came after me, you made this my fight. And let me tell you something, when you push someone too far, you better be ready for the consequences." He crouched down to meet the biker's eyes, his tone low and deliberate. "Next time you see a taxi driver, or anyone for that matter, you remember tonight. You remember that not everyone is what they seem." The biker shrank under Joseph's gaze, his earlier bravado extinguished. Joseph stood up, brushing off his jacket as though shaking off the remnants of the confrontation. He scanned the lot, his eyes falling on the mangled motorcycles scattered across the pavement. It wasn't just their pride that had been battered tonight, their prized machines bore the scars of their recklessness as well. With a sigh, he pulled a phone from his pocket and tossed it to the nearest conscious biker. "Call the cops. Or don't. Frankly, I don't care. But if you think about coming after me again, you'll wish the police were the ones dealing with you." The biker fumbled with the phone, his hands shaking. You don't understand. The gang, they won't let this go. They'll come after you for this." Joseph smirked, climbing back into his cab. "Let them try." As he drove away, the rain began to fall harder, washing the blood and grime from his hands, both literal and metaphorical. The glow of the city lights reflected in the puddles on the road, a reminder of the life he had chosen and the life he had left behind. But tonight, something had shifted. Joseph picked up his radio and turned it on, the familiar crackle of dispatch filling the cab. He wasn't sure why he did it, maybe to remind himself that his world still made sense after the chaos of the evening. "Car 27, are you out there? We've got a pickup on 5th and Main," came the dispatcher's voice. Joseph smiled faintly. "Just another night in the city." "This is car 27, he replied, his tone calm. "I'm on my way." But as he drove to the pickup location, his thoughts lingered on Ryan, the young biker who had approached him earlier with a plea for help. Joseph hadn't forgotten their conversation, nor the fear in Ryan's eyes when he spoke of wanting to protect his sister. The following day, Joseph paid a visit to a dingy mechanic's shop on the outskirts of the city, a place where secrets were shared in hushed tones and favors were bartered without a paper trail. The shop owner, an old friend from Joseph's past, greeted him with a knowing look. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Joseph shrugged. "Just tying up loose ends." Sliding a folded piece of paper across the counter, Joseph said, "This is where you'll find them. The ones who think they run the streets. Let the right people know." The shop owner unfolded the paper, nodding as he read the names and addresses scribbled in Joseph's precise handwriting. "You sure about this? They'll know it came from you." "I'm counting on it," Joseph said, his voice steady. Meanwhile, Ryan sat in a small apartment with his sister, her wide eyes filled with questions she was too afraid to ask. He hadn't told her what had happened the night before, but she could sense that something had changed in him. A knock on the door startled them both. Ryan opened it cautiously, only to find an unmarked envelope on the ground. Inside was a handwritten note and a stack of cash. "For a fresh start. Don't waste it. J." Ryan's hands trembled as he read the note. He looked out into the hallway, but it was empty. He knew who it was from. Joseph returned to his routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The city felt quieter, as though the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly. He parked his cab at the usual diner for his break, sipping a cup of black coffee as he gazed out the window. The world kept moving, oblivious to the battles fought in its shadows. But Joseph didn't mind. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. He had made his peace with being a ghost, drifting through the city unseen, intervening only when the scales tipped too far in the wrong direction. As the rain began to fall again, Joseph finished his coffee and headed back to his cab. The radio crackled to life with another job, and he answered without hesitation. Sometimes justice wasn't served in courtrooms or through formal channels. Sometimes it was delivered in parking lots, on rain-slick streets, by those who understood what it meant to fight for what was right. Joseph didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a man with a past, doing what he could to make the present a little better for people like Ryan, for families like his own. And as the cab disappeared into the city's labyrinth of streets, Joseph felt a quiet satisfaction. Because tonight, he had reminded the city of one simple truth: even in the darkest corners, justice had a way of finding its light. Some people say the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Maybe it's because they've learned patience. Or maybe it's because they've already faced the worst life can throw at them and come out stronger. Either way, Joseph Carter wasn't the kind of man you messed with. Not tonight. Not ever. As he drove through the city, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, Joseph couldn't help but think about the truth that often went unnoticed in the chaos of life. People are quick to judge by appearances. They look at someone quiet, someone humble, and assume they know everything about them. But in the silence, in the unspoken moments, there's a strength that can't be measured. A strength that only reveals itself when it's needed most. Joseph had been through things that would break most people. Loss. Hardships. Battles fought and won, some of them in the open, others in the dark corners of life where no one could see. And yet, he had survived it all. Not because he was invincible, but because he knew the value of patience. Because he understood the power of quiet strength. The city seemed endless at night, with its winding roads and hidden corners. For most people, it was a maze of concrete and steel. But for Joseph, it was a familiar landscape, a place he knew like the back of his hand. The people he passed in the streets, the faces in the cars beside him, none of them knew his story. They didn't know the quiet battles he fought every day. The ones that didn't need to be fought out loud. And that was just how he liked it. Joseph wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He didn't need anyone to tell him he'd done the right thing. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he had to do. In a world that often seemed unfair, where power was measured by noise and force, Joseph had learned that true strength wasn't in the loudest shout or the biggest fight. True strength was in the ability to stand firm in your beliefs, even when no one was watching. It was in knowing when to act, and when to let the world make its own mistakes. When the bikers had surrounded him, Joseph hadn't panicked. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to outmuscle them. He had simply waited. Watched. And when the time was right, he had acted. Swift. Decisive. He knew that patience was a weapon, just as much as any punch or kick. And that was what made him dangerous. As Joseph drove through the quiet streets, his mind wandered to Ryan, the young man who had tried so hard to prove himself. Ryan had been lost, like so many others, looking for a way to make his mark, to prove he was somebody. But Joseph knew that the truth wasn't in how loud you could shout or how tough you looked. It was in your actions. It was in the way you treated people. Ryan had learned that lesson, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. The money Joseph had left him wasn't just to help him escape the gang's grip. It was a chance. A chance to turn his life around, to choose a different path. Maybe one day, Ryan would understand what Joseph had done for him. Or maybe, he wouldn't need to. Maybe he would find his own strength, just as Joseph had found his. Joseph's thoughts returned to his own past, to the days when he had been younger, full of hope and ambition, ready to take on the world. Back then, he had thought strength was something you could show. Something you could prove. But as the years went by, he had learned that strength wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about standing tall when the world tried to knock you down. That was what made Joseph who he was. That was the quiet power he carried with him every day. As the city lights faded behind him, Joseph found himself thinking about the larger picture. About how every decision, every moment, was part of a bigger story. A story not just about him, but about everyone he met along the way. The people who crossed his path, the ones who challenged him, and the ones who needed his help. They were all part of the same story, the story of survival. Of resilience. Of learning how to navigate the storm without being swallowed by it. Joseph wasn't just a taxi driver. He was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how dark things got, no matter how tough the world seemed, there was always a way to fight back. Not with noise or violence, but with the quiet certainty that you could weather any storm if you just stayed calm and kept moving forward. The cab glided through the streets, as it had done countless times before. And yet, tonight, everything felt different. It felt like the city had learned a lesson. Like the shadowy corners and the back alleys held a little less power than they did before. And for the first time in a long while, Joseph felt a quiet peace settle over him. Not because he had done anything extraordinary, but because he knew, deep down, that sometimes, the most extraordinary thing you can do is just stand your ground and stay true to who you are. That was the lesson Joseph had learned over the years. And it was the lesson he hoped the city would remember. Some people say the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Maybe it's because they've learned patience. Or maybe it's because they've already faced the worst life can throw at them and come out stronger. But Joseph knew the truth. Strength wasn't about how loud you could be or how many people you could intimidate. Strength was about the ability to hold your ground and do what was right, no matter the cost. And tonight, Joseph had done just that. He had shown the world that sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who holds the most power. The one who has the wisdom to wait, to observe, and to strike when the moment is right. Joseph Carter wasn't the kind of man you messed with. Not tonight. Not ever. And in the silence of the city, as his cab disappeared into the night, he knew that his story, his quiet story, would be remembered by those who had the eyes to see it.